And we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This is a long anticipated live stream with Louis Fishman. For those who don't know, Louis Fishman is an associate professor at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. He works on Ottoman Palestine and has a special interest in Ottoman politics during the Young Turk period. He also writes on Turkish, Israeli, and Palestinian affairs. He divides his time between New York, Istanbul, and Tel Aviv. Louis, it's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, this has been a conversation I've been wanting to have for a long time. You know, the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Ottoman Palestine is a topic of much interest, not only myself, but I know many of our viewers. On one hand, they say that, Jews were dhimmis, we weren't treated well, life was shit. On the other hand, we hear it was beautiful, it was perfect, life was beautiful. I'm guessing it was probably something in between. As with most things of the conflict, each side takes a little bit of an extreme approach and stretches the truth just a little bit. That would be my guess, but I know that in an hour from now, I'm going to be much more informed than I currently am. So I am interested in knowing from you. Just feel free to give a breakdown. What was life like? What were the dynamics between Jews and Arabs? When did it start going wrong?
Yeah, so I think first of all, what we need to do is try to erase the history that happens after 1917 Balfour Declaration, right? The Balfour Declaration hovers over us. It's a huge monumental moment where both the Palestinians and the Jewish communities transform leaps and bounds in different directions. That should be the first thing. Now, we can't go back and give a whole history of Jews under Islamic empires. But if we look at the Ottoman Empire in general, yes, Jews were considered dhimmis in Islam. Jews and Christians are people of the book. Muslim men can marry Jews and Christians. Of course, by Islam, the father defines who the religion. By Judaism, it's a mother. So we can, that later on we can even talk, because there was intermarriage between even Jews and Palestinians up until now there are. In fact, it's something that's consistent throughout history. Sometimes small numbers, sometimes larger numbers, different things like that. But let's go back to this question of the dhimmis, or the protected minorities, or this idea that they were discriminated against because they're having to pay the jizya, the poll tax, right? What I try to point out to my students, friends, parties in New York, when you go to a party and you say you do Palestine, Israel, people jump up and say, "Oh wow, you must have a lot of controversy," and then I say no, and I start talking. But when this topic comes up, and often does, Jews were discriminated under Islam for so many years, and I say to them, let's remember that there was no notion of equality before the modern era, right? So Jews and Christians, yes, they were dhimmis, and yes, they had a poll tax, but Muslims weren't equal during this period, that time also. If you're a peasant, you're certainly not equal. You have no equality to someone that's in the city in terms of rights. In the U.S., you talk about, obligations and rights, but obligations and rights transcends whether you're, a city goer, if you're a muhtar, a village leader, you're not going to be equal with those peasants that are working. And I work later on. We can talk about. I work with documents that are petitions by peasants, by middle people, by urban people. So let's erase this idea that there was equality at all. But from all the way from the Tanzimat era to the 1880s, when there's the first constitution in the Ottoman Empire, the non-Muslims, already from 1856, defined in the 1869 citizenship law, non-Muslims were equal to Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. That whole dhimmi status disappears within the 19th century. And you do have something that is this sense of equality across the board. So from the 1860s, 1870s, Jews in the Ottoman Empire, whether they're in Palestine, whether they're in Syria, whether they're in the center of Istanbul, they're able to go to schools. Aside Muslims, they join the foreign department in the Ottoman government, and they're not subjected to their traditional roles, let's say per se, of translators or doctors in the palace or numerous artisans, different things like this, right? So we need to come back. Let's come back to the point that, yeah, there was no sense of equality. So equality for Jews within the Ottoman era is happening pretty much parallel to what's happening in Europe. Where France, with the French Revolution, to Russia, that offers them rights and retracts those rights later on in the 1880s. Okay, so the Ottoman or the Islamic the empire that we're talking about is not very, very different. What I will say, though, and then we can go back to maybe more questions, is that Jews were an integral fabric of the Ottoman Empire, meaning any major city, whether it's the holy city of Jerusalem, whether it's Cairo that was semi under Ottoman rule, especially Istanbul, Izmir, Damascus, Baghdad, all these cities that were classically Ottoman or Islamic, a major component was they always have to have Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? That's so it's more than just sort of this cliche, they all live together happily. Yes, there were days where there were more difficult days, there were better days, right? But, if you go to Ortaköy in Istanbul today, you're going to see from the late 19th century a church, a mosque, and a synagogue juxtaposed to one another within a city square. But then if you go back to the 15th, 16th century, after the Ottoman rule in conquest of Istanbul, you'll have something very similar. A city square in Balat where you have a synagogue, a church, and a mosque. So they were a part of that integral fabric of Ottoman society. And then we can talk about what changes later on. But I think that's something very important to understand, that we often erase the history. I'll be talking a lot about erasing the history. And this is something that's been erased on account of people sometimes make cheap claims or claims they really believe that Jews were always discriminated against in the Ottoman lands, right? So I'll just end by saying there was no sense of equality. Jews and Christians did not do army service also. By 1909, they're being recruited to the army. Okay, so some very happily, some people not so happy. And of course, the very last sentence, I promise this will be last sentence 3 times now. The very last sentence is that for rabbis and for priests alike, often this idea of equality didn't sit so well. So first of all, the poll tax that they're paying is not paid in, the Ottoman administrators don't knock on the door of every Jewish family and says, give us money. This is collected through the community, right? And the community will pay that certain tax. And it's often collected through kosher meat, purchase of kosher meat, the extra tax that is put there, and through that money that they pay. And by the late 19th century, Jews are also getting very upset that the monopolies on kosher meat, so which is very interesting for today's discussion also. I mean, this is something that's continuous, this monopoly over meat that makes it very, very expensive for Jews who do not have, the have-nots, to actually purchase meat, because there is that extra tax on it at sometimes. Okay, but they don't go to the military. And by not going to military, that's something important. They're worried about the military. They're worried about kosher food in the army service. And most, coming back to rabbis and priests, they're worried that the more that they get equality, they're going to not be going to Talmud Torah to study the Torah, right? And they're not going to go to the family business, or they're not going to go become religious scholars, the head of the Bet Din, or they're not going to work in the Bet Din, they're not going to work in the synagogues, they're not going to work in the, so it's very parallel to the Islamic society, right? That they're not going to go to the madrasas, okay, and they're going to go to modern education. So it really is a complicated topic. maybe we can end this question there, because it's something we could talk about throughout this podcast.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that breakdown. So it sounds like the rights Jews had in the Ottoman Empire were as good, if not better, than any other place on earth at the time. So in a historical context, it was, even you could call it progressive in terms of how minorities were treated. And
Yeah, I wouldn't call it progressive though, because it's within a certain framework of a balance that has been created over hundreds of years, right? So you do have, by the 1850s, 60s, you sometimes will have. I write a lot about. I'm more spoken about the early 20th century, how anti-Semitism arises there, and it's actually at the breakdown of of this balance, right, and the rise of nationalism, that you do start getting much more, I would say, tensions between communities. But I wouldn't use the word progressive. I would use the word pre-modern here. Really, it was a pre-modern idea that today sounds very liberal progressive, right? It sounds like it, but it really isn't. Because why do I say that? Because if you have, I always use the example of the Dernek. If you have, which is in today's Turkey, if you have a large Jewish community there, you have 13 Jewish communities. Those communities don't intermarry with each other. And in 1905, there's a fire, right? And that fire burns down the synagogues, and they build one synagogue for everyone. And it's modeled on the synagogue in Vienna that was recently reopened, rebuilt, and stuff like this in Turkey about 5-6 years ago. So that idea of progressive liberal is misleading, because the Jews themselves don't intermarry with each other usually, right? We're talking a very, the Jewish community of all communities is a very conservative community, not in terms of religion, perhaps. You know, when you look at Sephardic Jews compared to Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardics look very laid back, right?
right.
But they're still very, very conservative, extremely conservative, and I think we have to remember that we're working within a very conservative system. Now, within that conservative system, that doesn't mean we're talking about a Sharia state. We're not talking about that in the Ottoman Empire. You know, we can talk about a lot of things if we look at the daily acts of people don't necessarily fit religious acts, but there is a sense of conservativeness in the empire. So I would be careful to call it progressive.
So, okay, I hear that. I guess when I say progressive, I don't mean like politically progressive as we see it today, but progressive in terms of more a level of equality that was unique compared to other places in the world, or was it quite like the standard? Like, was the Ottoman Empire kind of leading with minority rights in the 1800s?
But they're not really, until they're recognized as the equals. They're not considered minorities. This is what I'm saying. So that you get what I'm saying. So yes, they're technically minorities, but minorities is very subjective. Did the Jews see themselves as minorities in the Ottoman Empire? I highly doubt that they know they're not the majority, but there's no Muslim majority either, right? There's no Muslim majority. Either you're part of the Janissaries, if you're in the city, a military faction, or you're urban Gors, or you're peasants, or you're there's no sense of majority, the sense of majority. They're not, Jews are looking at it. It's their home. And when we come back, let's move this back to Ottoman Palestine. There is a sense that Jewish people in Palestine are within their homeland without this being political also, right? This is and Jews and Arabs both see each other as part of, I would say, this balance, right? And it's when the balance is undone, right? And that's the rise of Zionism, or the rise of Jewish migration, more correctly, right? Then the balance is offset, right? And then you get issues. So once again, I'm not saying that they're less or more equal to Europe. Certainly Europe, by them, are offering them, I would say, offering Jews much more, but as citizens, right? And then in the 1869 citizenship law, and before 1856, this is when Jews start integrating as equals. And by 1909, you have a gung-ho group of Ottoman Jews, both in Palestine and in other places, that say we want to join the army. And I write about the Ottomans, and I write about Ottoman Zionism. We can talk about that in a second, right? But that sort of that idea that we can be part of this empire, right, is very, very substantial. It's a huge movement, and it includes Armenians and Greeks also, right? Armenians and Greeks also are saying we can become part of the Ottomans. Because let me just add a little layer to this. After the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, the terms of Ottomanism turns into what we call a civic nationalism. Very different than Russian nationalism, right? Russian nationalism is sort of this ethnic religious nationalism where Jews are excluded, even if they are citizens, right? Because they're not Russian Orthodox. So a Jew in Russia in the 1880s can jump up and down and do somersaults in the air 1,000 times, saying, I'm Russian, I'm Russian, I'm Russian. And they'll say, no, you're not. In the Ottoman Empire, by 1908, 1909, it's a very small window of time when you have the emergence of Turkish nationalism, ethnic Turkish nationalism. You have this idea that everyone can become Ottoman. Ottoman Jew, Ottoman Armenian, Ottoman Greek, Ottoman Muslim. Now, I changed that formula a bit, but that's sort of the understanding of most historians now, right? So that sense of nationalism is able to even embrace they're able to embrace that nationalism, and that nationalism embraces them as a minority, because now they're in the sense of equality, right? And once you have a sense of equality, you know who the minority is, you know who the majority is, because that minority-majority relations changes the relations between Muslims also, right? The minute you talk about equality, then the peasant is also going to say, wait a minute, I have rights also. You get what I'm saying? So everything, we always like to look at the non-Muslims vis-a-vis the Muslims. We rarely look what's happening among Muslims themselves. The whole empire is transcending. It was a very interesting project, one that was cut short by World War I. And my work is on these years, basically.
Mm. So you mentioned the Tanzimat era. Can you elaborate on what that is?
So there are two edicts, 1839 and 1856, where the Ottomans proclaimed that they're going to modernize their state. Among them, it's talking about the first one. I mean, a lot of people said this first was under European pressure, but now we know that the Sultan Abdul-Majid was very sincere about creating a just system of taxes, of basically obligation rights, and that the state has a role in transforming the empire to something modern. By 1856, it's now, in terms vis-a-vis the non-Muslims, this idea that equality is going to happen completely. And that's when you have the first constitution in the 1880s that's suspended very quickly. It offsets everything in the terms of equality. You have the 1908 revolution, that is the Young Turks. And the Young Turks basically are joined by Jews, Armenians, and Greeks as sort of a hope for change. Now, this Young Turk branch takes a swing during World War I, and that's where we see the empire really unravel with the Armenian massacres, later on full genocide, and you have also, it was just Armenians that was massacres of a lot of different Christian groups. And the Jews at this time in the Ottoman Empire are integrating in it. By this time, Palestine, something else is happening. Palestine is lost, and it's a Balfour Declaration. But if we could talk about this window of time, more importantly than Tanzimat, is this era and then Ottoman Palestine. And we bring it back to Palestine. In Palestine, for the first time, the Jewish community sees itself as able to integrate into the Ottoman Empire at large. And this is a part that is missed out of history. So if we talk about, I'm writing a new piece, probably a book, and I'm talking about the erasure of history. So what I talk about in my first book is that the Zionist narrative goes way too smoothly. First Aliyah, major immigration in 1881, the founders of the state, Ben Gurion and friends, second Aliyah in 1904, and then you go 1917 Balfour Declaration, British Mandate, and finally you have the 47 partition plan, right? It's a very smooth narrative. But if we look at it from 1914, no one would ever have imagined that 1948 would ever appear the way it did, right? That no one could imagine a Jewish state looking as, that if you go back in that era, you say, what would a Jewish state look like? Well, a lot of us can imagine there would be high tech and a thousand other things, right? Not in the Jewish state, in the world in general, right? Different, who could imagine there's gonna be telephones? Well, some did actually, right? Some did imagine TVs. Some did imagine, but overall, theoretically, what a state is going to look like is going to be very hard, and it's beyond there. Now we have two tracks here. We have one track of Theodor Herzl, who is an international Zionist, right? And that Theodor Herzl is inherently against Jewish immigration to Palestine because it's going to hinder his attempts to get a international deal for a Jewish homeland, which is given finally in 1903. Uganda is offered to the Jews through British colonialism, not Uganda, but now we say East Africa Holdings. And we know that the Zionist organization voted down. Herzl dies a year later, right, in 1904. So 1904 is going to be a crucial year. Up until 1904, from the 1880s to 1904, the majority of Jews coming to Palestine, even if they define themselves later on as Zionists, never see an independent state as their ultimate goal. This does not exist. And for the most part, they're Hebraizing. Already from the 1850s, you have secular education entering the Jewish schools. You have Hebrew on the curriculum. So yes, later on from the first Aliyah, you have Eliezer ben Yehuda, who comes, and he's sort of later on memorial. Even in his life, he's known as this sort of crazy person that, he opens the newspaper up, he speaks Hebrew to his kids, he teaches other people in the Yeshuv in Hebrew. But that doesn't mean they didn't know Hebrew before. What connected all the communities in Palestine, whether they're Algerian Moroccan community, whether they're the Ashkenazi community, whether they're the Syrian community, when people came to Jerusalem by the early 1900s, they are now communicating in Hebrew, and they're now adopting Hebrew as their main language.
Was this ancient Hebrew?
No, there's no sense of it. It's more medieval Hebrew, but there's no sense. Eliezer ben Yehuda wants to revive ancient Hebrew, by the way. So if you go to today, there's 3 newspapers in 1908, 1909. There's Hachirut, and if I open up Hachirut and I read it to you, okay, you're going to understand it like Hebrew today. Not a huge difference. It's a Sephardic newspaper. If I open up Eliezer ben Yehuda's Hatzvi, it's going to be difficult for you to understand because it's more trying to revive biblical Hebrew, using the future tense for the past tense, so forth and so on. But if you open up the religious Hasidic newspaper, Muria, you'll understand it like Hebrew today. If you open up, and the people I'm working with, including David Ben Gurion, all their writings are in Hebrew with each other. He comes in 1905. His Hebrew was brilliant. The fact that he wrote in Rashi script confused me. Okay, but he wrote in Rashi script. But they're all the Yeshuv by 1910. The Jewish community in Palestine, the Yeshuv, is Hebraizing, and that is now Why is this important for us? Because if you're a Jew in Baghdad, your mother tongue is Arabic. You're going to integrate into that Iraqi, what would become that Baghdadi community of other people, of other non-Muslims and Muslims, right? And Arabic is going to be your language. If you go to Turkey, what would become Turkey, Ladino is their language. By the way, Ladino, Jewish Spanish or Judeo-Espanol, right, from the Jews that came in 1492 to the Ottoman Empire, was the number one spoken language in Jerusalem up until around 1914. Was one of the most spoken languages. Okay, they knew Hebrew also, though. They knew Hebrew. So the people I'm reading, the Hebrew press, they're speaking either Arabic at home, Ladino at home, Yiddish at home, right? But they're writing in Hebrew. I don't want to say modern Hebrew because they didn't see it as a modern Hebrew, especially the Sephardic Jews, right? This is the Hebrew they know. Okay? So let me get back. So this idea is, if you're a Turkish Ladino speaker, your question is, do I learn Turkish or do I learn French? Right? In Palestine, the Jews are starting to adopt, no matter where you're from, they're starting to adopt Hebrew as their language. Okay, and that's how we know that the press is all in Hebrew. The writings between each other. Albert Antebi, the head of the Alliance Jewish French School, was fluent in Hebrew. He's from Damascus, goes to France, ends up in Jerusalem, Eretz Israel, and he's able to converse freely in Hebrew. In fact, he's spoken better French, but when he's speaking, sometimes they translate it to Hebrew for other people to understand that didn't understand French. He spoke French because the Ottoman governor was at the same event, right? So what I'm trying to get at is, we know so little, and this is the headline here. The headline, the important thing about all this, if we, all this huge amount of information I'm giving you now, the headline is we do not know the history of the Jewish community in Palestine before 1914, because a very ideological history has been written in and erased exactly what was happening, erased the multiplicity of Jews in Palestine that saw themselves as, on one hand, Zionists in the terms of creating a local Jewish Hebrew culture, but not seeing an independent state as an end goal. And they're able to influence the Jewish organization, what would become the World Zionist Organization, the Zionist Organization, which will become the WZO. By 1910 and 1911, the World Zionist Organization is saying, we do not want an independent state. We want to integrate into the Ottoman Empire and receive a sort of autonomy. Okay? Even the Zionist organization is forfeiting this idea of an independent Jewish state. They don't see it's possible. And only in 1919 do we start hearing words like first aliyah, second aliyah. Okay? Like, termed this way. There's no difference between Jews coming in 1860s and 1880s. One is that they are rural, but rural Jewish life started in Palestine by local Jews before the Jewish community from Russia came, right? And there was Jewish Ashkenazi immigration to the Ottoman lands also. I work on Anatolia. There's a place called Or Yehuda. Or Yehuda today, as you probably would know, is in Israel.
Yeah.
20 minutes from Tel Aviv.
Next to the airport. Yeah.
Yeah, the first Or Yehuda is 3 hours from Izmir, a Jewish farming school that's speaking Hebrew, okay, in Izmir, 3 hours from Izmir. It's called Akhisar. I visited it. I have an article you can read about. It's in my academia.edu, Memories of Jews Where They Don't Exist. I wrote an article about that. And so we have a Jewish settlement near Istanbul called Misilah Hadasha, the new path to Palestine. It's talking about, but it's founded in the early 1900s. in Istanbul, a Hebrew-speaking community. That's not Sephardic. That's not part of that. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of different ways we can go with questions, but
Yeah.
the idea is, and the headline here is that we really know very little about it. But what do we know about it also? We know two things concerning Palestinians. Palestinians during this era become very suspicious of any type of Zionism, which you don't find in the Ottoman in Istanbul. They're arguing. Some are saying Zionism is good. Some saying it's bad. Some saying Jewish migration is not Zionist, and they're able to come. Abdul Hamid said he's against it, but he allowed Jews were able to come in for numerous reasons throughout the time. They were not expelled, okay, through capitulations, other things, but there's no really major shift with the Young Turk era vis-a-vis Zionism. The only shift is that people are talking about it. And the debate over Zionism in Istanbul, I'm going to confuse matters, is actually over we want Jews or we don't want Jews, and there's a very anti-Semitic undertone to it. In Palestine, there's not an anti-Semitic undertone to it. They see Jewish migration as a threat from the 1880s, 1890s already. They see that there is going to be a convergence between that Herzlian Zionism and what's happening in Palestine, right? They get that connection. They get that connection. And it's actually because the Jews are Hebrewising and becoming, and they're separating as their own community, right? This is the linguistic divide becomes huge. Because if you have in 1909 three Jewish newspapers, Hachirut, Hatzvi, and Moria, you have three Arab newspapers, Philistine, Palestine, Quds Sharif, Holy Jerusalem, and you have El Carmel in the north. You have a Arabic newspaper founded, the Voice of the Ottomans, by Jews, but this was a lobbying mechanism to get Jews, to get Arabs, convince Arabs that Zionism is not bad, right? It was opened only for these purposes. Philistine, the name Philistine or El Carmel, they were very already what we can see promoting a local patriotism. And Palestinians start by 1908. The idea that this, I'm going to preempt a question, because the question is what you hear over and over on Twitter in the last year, and it's been there for decades. There was no such thing ever as Palestine. Philistine never existed. There was no state, and local Arabs never identified as Palestinians. And this is something, Palestinian identity was created in 1965 at the PLO. You have numerous. If you haven't heard it, I'm happy for you. But you know, already in the early 20th century, as different nationalisms are emerging, Palestinians start to say, wait a minute, we have this sort of local pride for our homeland, which they called Philistine. Philistine was the word you used. Eretz Israel was translatable to Philistine. I have a document, a Jewish document, that when they translate, it's the Rabbanut HaRishit, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. When they translate Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, they translate it to Arabic as Philistine. It's very important. Okay? So it's the only time I saw a parallel. But I'll give a spoiler to my book, and I say it at every conference, is I admit, this is a friendly conversation here, right? I admit that I like to drink beer, but put that aside, I have a Tuborg ad from 1911 in the newspaper Philistine for Tuborg beer. It's in Arabic, and it says, if you want, now for me, I think it's interesting, because today most Arab newspapers want to have an alcohol ad, right? Now, some people say, but they're Christian editors. These are Christians. But Raghib Khalidi was from the Khalidi family, was a regular contributor there, giving religious sermons sometimes even on the same pages where there's a beer. Okay, so that's how we see how how things transform over time. Things that were accepted or were okay then are not okay now. But for me, what's interesting about it is the fact that it says, if you want to sell this cool, nice, refreshing beer in the summer, right? Contact Yusuf, the distributor where? In Palestine was Syria, in Palestine and Syria. So for me, I'm trying to say that for them, that the word Palestine, there was nothing new. It's used in Ottoman documents often. It's used in different, meaning that area of the Holy Land. Where it starts and where it stops, you can argue, you can that. But the interesting notion is, my friend Adar, I can say, the interesting notion is that the Palestinians there start calling themselves Palestinian. Start calling them, saying, we are part of the Palestinian people. It's Shab al-Falastini. Rijal Palestine, the people of, or men of Palestine, or the so the Jewish community is not doing this. The Jewish community is not using the word Palestinian, and often when they're translating articles that are anti-Zionist into the mainstream Hebrew press, when the Palestinians use the term Palestine, they use the word Palestine also, to sort of highlight that this word's being used. Naturally, they don't translate it to Eretz Israel because they're doing a direct quote. In their paper, Isa, Palestine says Palestine's our homeland. So Palestine, Hamoledet, the homeland or something, right? So they translate it, right? As Palestine. As Palestine or Palestina sometimes even. Okay, so this is the dynamic. The dynamic is, to sum this part up, connected to Tanzimat, is that it's actually through the opening up of a more liberal system, or a system that allowed a greater room for new identities to emerge. Okay, that it was, in a sense, pushed onto the Ottomans for other reasons, nothing to do with Palestine. Palestine is considered the almost, Jerusalem has a special connection with Istanbul, but Palestine is less on the radar of many people in the Ottomans. So it's this room for new identities to emerge where you see rising tensions among the Jewish community and the Palestinian community. And that's why in my book, I say Jews and Palestinians claiming the homeland, right? 1914. I don't have the title right here, but I don't have my book around here. I usually bring it up and show it. But that's where I call them Jews, because I do not call them Palestinians, because after 1920, there's a sense that there were Palestinian Jews. There's a lot of people that say there were Palestinian Jews, and Zionism came and pushed that identity on them later on. And there were Jews, Arabs, and Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians all defined themselves as Palestinians. No, Christians and Muslims did. Jews, very rarely, if any time, have I seen them call themselves or even express a love of Palestine, and not Eretz Israel, right? The land of Israel.
Right. It almost reminds me of the coin that many people share. It says Palestine or Palestine, and then in parentheses, it's Aleph Yud Eretz Israel, which is funny because a lot of Palestinians share it as proof of the existence of Palestine, and then many Zionists would push back, say, but look at the parentheses. But it almost shows that's a representation of in a sense, the pluralism of the society at the time. Although that coin, I believe, was already British Mandate Palestine.
Yeah, that was British Mandate Palestine. But already in the early era, Jews are saying we want that Eretz Israel there. Now it's something political. But the roots of it are from a few years before that. It's not that they came up with this term, Eretz Israel suddenly, or no.
Right.
The chief rabbi doesn't put Eretz Israel; he puts Eretz HaKodesh. He does Aleph, Hey, Chupchik, and Kuf, right?
Mhm.
Eretz HaKodesh. It's an acronym.
Holy Land.
Yeah, Holy Land.
Holy
So
Land.
you
Yeah.
could say Eretz Israel, and you could say Eretz
Yeah.
HaKodesh. I'm just now in this new work I'm doing. Uh, I'm sort of trying to write a history post October 7th. We'll see if this comes out. I've never mentioned it until now, so I'm throwing this out.
Spoiler, yeah. The grand reveal here on Sulha.
So yeah. So I'm trying to do it, but I'm working on the Ottoman era, and I'm finding that the word aliyah, okay, the word ole, or it was very rarely used. I was reading something that said it was called immigrazia or mehegrim. People that moved to Eretz Israel in the pre-Balfour Declaration usually say, "Ani meheger," I'm a migrant or immigrant, right? They didn't have. But some of the religious communities used the word ole. It existed, right? But it's only in the post-Balfour Declaration era where you get it politicized, where you take that religious term and you place it on all Jews coming, right? And then the immigrants are seen as something less. You have the olim is like you're coming to change or transform yourself and transform the land, right? Where you're not a simple meheger, you're not a migrant, right? It's from the same root, right? Immigration's from the word lahager. It's the same root in Arabic also, right? Hagar, it comes from Hagar, right? The I guess second wife Abraham, Lahager, she moved, right? She moved.
Mm.
So, and I'm sure there's other different roots to that word in it, but that's where immigration comes from, I believe. Also the same word. So anyway, so you say Meheger, but after, so everything changes after the Balfour Declaration. Everything changes. Everything transcends. So that coin is important because both sides can use it, exactly how you pointed out. And
Right.
I find these arguments on Twitter. I've almost disappeared this year because I have been writing. I was in Jerusalem 6 months. We can talk about that. But I find them so frustrating. I write my book. I spend years doing the research. I put it on Amazon. Boom! First review saying there's no such thing as Palestine. There was never Palestine. This is all. And you just open up any newspaper, you do any search, you'll find that it's complete bonkers what they're saying, right? But there's a lot of power to it. People use it. You hear it all the time. Palestine didn't exist until the PLO created it to throw out all the Jews of the land.
Yeah,
And the
it's
flip side with Zionists saying the same thing. I mean, the flip side sometimes with the Arabs saying, "Oh, everything was great before Zionism," and no, yeah, you could argue before Zionism, but the Zionism of the late Ottoman era certainly wasn't centered colonialism. Certainly, before in the late Ottoman era, the children of Rehovot, I write about him, Karmi Eisenberg, fought in the Ottoman army. You have hundreds of Zionists that are born in Palestine fighting in the Ottoman army as proud Ottoman citizens. And the Ottomans accept them. They're officers. Karmi's an officer. He fights in the not just the World War I, he fights in the Balkan Wars. And he's I forget the word right now. In a second, I'll remember it. Ghazi. He's Ghazi Karmi Effendi. He gets the title Ghazi for fighter of a war. Okay, he dies in POW later on, teaching Hebrew in the camps, in POW camps in Russia. So this idea of taking what happens after the 1920s and applying it to the Ottoman era, you're just walking into a trap of either you don't know or you don't want to know, or you refuse to read the newspapers of that time.
So this is all very enlightening stuff. I have so many questions. I'm not even sure which direction to take it in. I guess I want to know a little bit more about the formation of Palestinian identity, because you as you mentioned, many people say there was no Palestine. But in fact, both Zionism and Palestinian nationalism were a result of the same global trend of nationalist movements. And it very well may be the case that Palestinian identity solidified as a response to Zionism, but it's not that there wasn't a greater macro considerations and a movement of nationalism happening which inspired this Palestinian nationalism. I guess what I'm wondering is, I know that there was a lot of, in the earlier days, there was a lot of talk of not Palestine being an independent state, but it being part of Greater Syria, right? So there would be Greater Syria, and then there would be the Palestinian province of Greater Syria. Was there a tension at all between Arabs that wanted Greater Syria and then maybe Palestinian Arabs that said, no, we don't want Greater Syria, but we want Palestine as an independent state? Did that tension exist? And if not, when did that separation happen, where they kind of moved away from the notion of Greater Syria towards an independent Palestinian state?
So Adar, that's a fantastic question. It's something I'm grappling with actually right now, because my work stops in 1914. It doesn't really go up to the Greater Syria. What I can tell you is that, once again, people use Greater Syria, whether it's the pro-Israel camps that want to deny Palestinian existence, and they say, hey, they were Syrians, right? Or whether you have some very ultra-Arab nationalists that say the Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria were all the result of the Sykes-Picot and the divisions of the Ottoman Empire, right, into nation states. So there's a little truth, I think, in both, in that you have, in 1917, the worst possible scenario for Arabs, and that is they become part. They fall to British colonialism, right? For some reason, both Palestinians close to Egypt, not for some reason, and Iraq, what would become Iraq, they are obsessed with the fear that they might one day fall to the British. And both of them provide routes to the Mediterranean, from India to the Mediterranean. So think about that. This is why they're so important. That's why Iraq and Palestine. So this right before October 7th, they were talking about creating the Biden with some of this corridor from Saudi Arabia through all the way up through Israel and to the Mediterranean, right? This was part of that idea of peace there was going to be, before October 7th, peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia was around the corner. They're going to create this corridor. And it actually goes back to the Syrian civil war, where trucks weren't allowed to go around. They couldn't go through Syria or parts of Iraq. And Israel was facilitating through Haifa trucks going overland to the Gulf and to Saudi Arabia. So in late Ottoman Palestine, they're already talking about that corridor. They're already talking about, certainly there's going, the Palestinians in one of their petitions say, we're worried that, they're going to create a corridor from India all the way to the Mediterranean through Palestine, a train. Very interesting. They do not see Jews as Europeans per se during this period. They always talk about the fear of Europeans and the growing Jewish presence or Jewish hegemony, right? They don't see, Jews were never, the Palestinians always understood the religious connection Jews have to Palestine, and that it's an integral part of their sort of worldview, right? In the previous political era. So that's one thing. Now I'm doing the professor thing where I forgot the original question. Oh, Palestinian identity, yeah, with Syria. So during the late Ottoman era, you do have the emergence of a sort of a Lebanese identity, Palestinian identity, Syrian identity. That same Palestinian that might call himself Shaba Palestini, when they go to New York, they might call themselves Syrians. And we know that when they went to South America, they were called Turcos, which remain today, right? Jews in Mexico or in South America are often called Turcos because they came from the Ottoman Empire. They are not Turks, right? So that way of defining yourself is pretty tricky. Who are you speaking to? Who are you defining yourself vis-a-vis or what? So after World War I, we said the worst possible scenario, this is where I was at, I got back to it, is falling to British colonization. And worse, you have Sharif Hussein cuts a deal with the British in the Arab Revolt that his son gets Faisal, goes to Syria and establishes the Syrian kingdom. Now the Palestinians are at a point here. Do we go on our own or do we join other Syrians in our struggle? And it only makes sense that you would go with the larger group. All of them knew that the intentions of France and Britain were insincere and that they proved to be dangerous to them, that they were only made to divide the local populations. The Americans, Woodrow Wilson sends the Crane Commission to say he's suspicious of the British and French. Woodrow Wilson. So the Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese won't be suspicious. Now, two groups are bound to get quite a bit out of it. First of all, Faisal, for example, the community is anti-Zionist, anti-Balfour Declaration 100%. Faisal, before he's thrown out in 1920, makes a deal with Chaim Weizmann, the Faisal Weizmann. And Jews were willing to accept some kind of autonomous homeland in Palestine within that kingdom of Faisal's kingdom, of the greater Arab kingdom, the Syrian Arab kingdom. Okay? So now the Syrians are joining that kingdom. Palestinians are joining, representing southern Syria. But let me tell you, before 1918, I do not see the word southern Syria ever. I've never seen it one time in my life where they define Palestine as Syria al-Junubiyya, the southern Syria. It doesn't exist. And that's been put in our mind like first aliyah and second aliyah. That's been stamped into our mind, etched into our memory. And we say, oh, they always saw themselves as southern Syria. No, they might have called themselves Syrians, but that was Palestine. That wasn't, maybe it's included in this Sham, whatever Sham means, which is Syria. So we have a lot of finagling history to suit our own needs. So
Right.
yes, Palestinians were obviously making sense that we'd be better with Syria. The Jewish community, of course, is going to be wiped out and a new community is going to come. And that's David Ben Gurion, who was virtually unknown in the late Ottoman era. I mean, people know who he is. He's in Istanbul. All the labor Zionists are in Istanbul studying in parliament, right? Hoping one day go to parliament, and in an Ottoman system. So if you think that the labor Zionists are just going to Istanbul to study for fun, well, that's surprise. The Ottomans lose. Moshe Sheret leaves Istanbul. He picks up his grades in Istanbul and then goes on to London to study. Okay, so yes, that greater Syria is something, but we can't put too much on it because when King Crane Commission goes to Jerusalem, the Palestinians are saying we want some type of autonomy here in Jerusalem, at least for our community. I mean, they see now when they do a polling of everyone, it's a very small percent that wants some kind of autonomy for southern Syria, Palestine, but it's there. Meaning leaders know that they have something to lose. Remember, everyone's working within the Ottoman system, where the metropole is Istanbul. So Damascus and and Jerusalem aren't competing with each other. In a Syrian state, they would be competing with each other.
Right.
100%. So the idea that the Palestinians have something to lose, for sure. The idea that after 1920, the French come and say, you know what, Faisal? Sorry. This was promised us by the British. He then is given Iraq, becomes king of Iraq. His brother's given the king of Transjordan. Okay, Abdullah. And now it's British and French imperialism mandates over Syria and Palestine. So up until the 20s, some Palestinians are still saying, let's unite with Syria. But by 1930, this is ending, right? This is not going to happen. And that's where they come back to the Palestinian identity. So if we have, in my class, I draw a line here. I put Palestine identity here, Arab identity here. And later on, you could add maybe Islamist identity or where Hamas would fit in. So over time, sometimes it goes close to the Arab, sometimes it goes closer to Palestinian, sometimes it goes to 1960s. The failure of the Arab countries to produce anything leads Palestinians to say, once again, we really should rely on ourselves. They failed us in 48. They failed us in 67. They failed us in World War I also, you could argue. Okay? So identity is something that is always transforming. And in Israel, we see 75, 76 years of a state. We see a big, heavy education system. But yet some people in Israel define themselves first as Jews and then as Israelis. And some Israelis say, no, I'm first Israeli, then I'm Jewish. You understand? And
Right.
this changes over time. No one's saying, oh, there's no such thing as Israeli identity, Look at 20% define. I imagine 30 or 40% of Israel might define them first as Jews, right? As, what are you? So then they say, but Hasidics are anti-Zionists, or that, Hasidics, whether they're anti-Zionism or Zionism, and this is going to be a huge headline that we didn't mention, and I have to mention this. Anti-Zionism in the late Ottoman era is not whether Jews should come to Palestine or they shouldn't come to Palestine. The anti-Zionists within the Ottoman political world, Jews, still believe, for most except one or two people, still believe in Jewish migration to Palestine. Because if you're in Palestine, if you're a Jew in Jerusalem, you're not going to say, I'm against immigration of Jews. Why? Because your community has to grow. They have to thrive. You want Jews to come, to join your community, for the strengthen your community. It's the simple things. You have migration to South America. Jews are also leaving. So Jews, like other Muslims and Christians, are saying, wait a minute, our people are leaving. Who's going to be with us? Okay? So all these terms change at World War I. But yeah, the identities. And by the way, I was going to mention the Maronites had a reason to go against Syria, very much like the Jewish community, right? They have their own interest here. Their own interest is to create a Lebanese Christian state at all costs, and to break away from Syria, right? In this, or not to be part of that Syrian. Okay, you have a large group of Arab Christians in Lebanon to this day that say we should have been part of Syria. This was a Maronite plot to da-da-da-da-da. Okay, today no one's going to argue that they're all Lebanese. No one's going to argue they're all Syrians. And that's where we get to this, post-Ottoman. Maybe if you have one more question, ask, and I can talk about, I can sort of share this idea that I'm working on post-Ottoman states. Or I can do that now, and then you can ask another question.
Yeah, sure. How much time do you have?
I have about 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes. Okay, there are some audience questions as well, so maybe we'll do...
Can I see them up on the thing? Or?
Yeah, you should see a tab called Comments. Just the
yes, I got it up there.
You got it?
Oh, it's so nice.
But I don't know if we're going to have time for all of them, so Hold on, I'm just the
There,
sun
there,
is.
there, there. Oh wow, there's quite a few. I didn't. Wow, wow, wow. Hello everyone. Hello everyone. I'm saying hello
People
all.
are
Hello.
people are intrigued. Yeah.
Hello. Sorry for bothering you. Should I read this? You want to choose them or I should, Jared?
Yeah,
You-
yeah. I'll choose them. Well, I guess there's one more thing I really wanted to know, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
maybe we'll
Go ahead.
one audience question, and then you could share anything else you'd like to. And
Yes.
this question is very niche, so you might not really know much about it. So just let me know if not. But
Yeah, yeah.
we often hear about like Jordan and how that was also Palestine, and many people or some people have this unrealistic idea that that's what a two-state solution would look like. Palestine is Jordan, and then the entire land from the river to the sea is Israel. But I'm more interested in what the relationship between Palestinians east of the Jordan River and west of the Jordan River, like, did they also have this nationalist movement? Did they view themselves as the same people? What really was that dynamic?
So first of all, Adar, you know Hebrew. So the first part of your question about Jordan being the Palestinian state and this and this and this. So I'll just tell you what I teach my students one Hebrew saying kishkush balabush, right? Yeah.
Right. It's not relevant.
It's not relevant.
Not
But
relevant.
of course, it was played with for years by Israeli politicians for decades and decades, trying to undermine Israel's closest ally in the region for years, right? Jordanians, right? Saying that this is actually just Palestine there, and something. Remember, I mentioned before that it's when Faisal loses Jordan, is when Abdullah gets as sort of a president, this Transjordan area. Now, in the Balfour Declaration, Transjordan was part of it. In Ottoman Palestine, in pre-Ottoman Palestine, post-Ottoman Palestine, what was happening on the west, on what Transjordan, which is a biblical term, Ever HaYordan, right? It actually is it took me so many years to understand that when you say Ever HaYordan, that's Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River, right? Was you had Bedouin uprisings during the Ottoman period. You have a very nomadic community. Someone called you Hey Nomad. I didn't know where that was, but it was a nomadic community of Bedouins. Very little there, very little there. And yes, if all the states that are constructed as states that didn't exist, you could argue Iraq for one, but certainly Jordan, right? Jordan, there was no, the Hashemite Empire has created, surprisingly, the most longest and solid state infrastructure that exists compared to Turkey or compared to even Saudi Arabia. It's very interesting that what remains of the post Ottoman era, things as the strong states are the monarchs. Okay, now tomorrow we could talk about it. We won't get into Jordanian politics, but there's no denying that there's a Jordanian people in Jordan, and what does that mean? Yes, there's a majority of Palestinians. You could argue, but what does that mean, Jordanian stuff like that? It's like many countries, a lot of countries, don't. That's sort of that leads us to the question of this Palestinian. There was no such thing as an independent Palestine ever. Okay, so what? That doesn't mean that identities don't work according to legal terms only and stuff like that. So that was with the question.
Yeah, and just
What
by
was
the
your
way,
second part, though? Your second part was more important.
well, yeah, I just want to say on that note, there was actually never a Jewish state until 1948. There was a Jewish
Absolutely.
kingdom. There was a Jewish
Absolutely.
territory, but never a Jewish state, right? That's
Exactly.
also the state of Israel, is only 75 years old.
Exactly.
So
The second part was more interesting, and I lost my.
well, it was more so just about like the dynamic, like you're pretty
what's
much
happening on the other side? Yeah.
yeah,
So what's happening? Yeah. So really, even in Ottoman times and later, it really is its own separate entity. Its own. It's not that they don't identify themselves as Palestinians. Palestinians, for the most part, see Palestine as almost a replica of the map of Eretz Israel. I love it when you see necklaces, of all of Israel or all of Palestine, right? And they have such clean-cut borders. They're etched into our mind, right? Of course, these borders, no one imagined that it was going to go down a little bit here and up here
Right,
and
right,
around
right.
here and stuff like that. But that's sort of etched in our mind. But more or less, Palestine for what people that define this as Palestinians or the Arabs living there, or see the word Palestine as almost equal to Eretz Israel. For sometime in the late Ottoman era, some people were thinking it's more the district of Jerusalem, meaning Philistine is the south and the north is part of Shem. But the Ottoman borders, people didn't identify according to Ottoman borders. This we know. Beirut was mostly ran by Sunni politicians for example, and it doesn't. And you had your own Mount Lebanon was its own independent thing. So you had something called Greater Lebanon after 1920s, and that's what it became, and that was including the large Shia population. But Shias weren't seen as even really being part of Lebanon in the 20s, right? And there was never a Maronite majority of the Christians or a Christian majority even. They were counting people outside of Lebanese borders also. They're counting the Christians, they're not counting the Muslims, and they're counting Armenians and not counting Kurds that are in Lebanese border, right? So all of these states are to an extent constructed, like you said, Israel also. I mean, Israel. It's who you count and who you don't count. I think that's what the important question is: who do you count and who do you not count? The Ministry of Interior is very happy to count every person that say they're a Jew, right? Not the Ministry of Interior, the state, But then you get religious people say, "Oh, they're not Jewish; they are Jewish." If you think about it, many people that survived the Holocaust weren't Jewish. They became Jewish through their grandfather was Jewish. They were sent to camps, and then they came to Israel as Jews. No one questioned their Judaism, right? No one questioned. They're Israeli
Right.
now. So it's who you count and it's who you don't count. This is the interesting thing. And with Jordan, I would put that aside. It really it's an interesting dynamic of why the Palestinians see the Jordan River, but yeah.
But so that was a natural cutoff prior to the
Absolutely.
establishment of, okay, interesting.
And if you think geographically, it goes into the desert, basically.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we do know that natural borders are mountains and rivers and stuff like that before the map was carved up, with artificial borders. Okay,
And
so
by the
we'll
way, my deadline of 15 minutes is now been extended because I like questions, and
cool.
People get really frustrated. So if people have multiple questions, something different, but each one should have their question answered in some way or some
Yeah.
form.
So let me know whenever you have to go. If not, we'll read the questions. We will prioritize super chats for whoever wants to support the show. We'll start with the question from Mutinous11. And by the way, Mutinous, thank you for recommending that podcast. Mutinous recommended this podcast called the Martyr Made Podcast, a series. The series is called Fear and Loathing in a New Jerusalem. Louis, I would suggest, if you have time, and anybody checking it out, because it is super informative, super eye-opening. I've learned so much. So thank you for that suggestion. So Mutinous asks, on property rights, was it true the majority of residents were mainly peasants harvesting the land while paying taxes to landlords who lived in Beirut, Damascus, Istanbul, etc.? And I want to expand on that. And I want to expand on that. And how did land ownership in Ottoman Palestine come to be?
Yeah. This it hits at the heart of many of my argument with Palestinian identity is made up of. So the peasants, and now I'm embarrassed, I have to get the date of the new land law that comes in the 1860s. Basically, the Ottomans are saying we're giving more power to the peasants. Peasants are worried about registering their name. If you register your name, you're going to pay higher tax. You're going to pay taxes, and you're going to have to serve in the army. They allow these families in Beirut mostly to buy their lands, and it's these people that start selling their land to Zionists, and you have the first sort of expulsions from land. Okay, so I think that the question is not about who's the majority of paying the taxes, right? It's who's the majority among the Palestinian community would be the peasants, would absolutely be the peasants. But this is where we have something unique about Palestinian identity, is that the urban writers, the Christian writers especially, understood nationalism. You need to have a peasant class sort of within every classical nationalist movement, right? And the peasants are providing the daily bread of everyone, and the peasants are working hard, and you start to identify with them as, something hardworking, strong. But on the other hand, you have this relationship where you exploit them all the time, right? This is a sort of two-tiered system. So what we noticed is that the more peasants left working the land because of these land sales of people in Beirut and other places, the peasants are starting to immigrate to the urban areas. And already in 1909, 1910, Palestinian thinkers start to say, you know what? Look what the Jewish National Fund is doing. Let's do the same thing. Let's create a fund to buy lands or to ensure that they are not sold to Zionists, and create sort of a better living environment for the peasant themselves. They start writing about the plight of the peasants. I have some Christian writers that are writing about it. It's very interesting. In Jerusalem, I was meeting with a Palestinian. I found out I wrote about their grandfather, and he had no idea that his grandfather had wrote this article from Ottoman times about the peasant and the role of the peasant. Palestine is the land of milk and honey, but without the peasant, what would we be? So that, so the division of support, you have Muslims that are working with Istanbul, and you have Christians that are writing a lot, and they merge together in their struggle over the land. So I think that that problem. So I work on a place called it's right near Afula, the city of Afula, but it's called El Fula, where peasants are starting to write petitions. And they talk about the absentee landlords. They talk about the taxes, the weight of the taxes. We also have that in Bisan. I have a large amount of documents. I haven't really worked on them 100%. So yes, it's a great question. So many of them didn't own the land, but they wrote in the thing, this is our forefathers' land. The question is that, so the peasants never owned the land legally. Yes, that's true, but they would say this is the land, and we've been on it for time memorial, they would write. Okay? And that's really when the land sales starts pushing buttons. Because once the peasants leave, then the local muhtar, the head of the village, is not so important either, right? And those taxes aren't going to go to the people in the urban areas, also the ones that rely on it, right? So it's sort of like a domino effect that, and that continues up to 1936 revolt in Palestine. That landless peasant class was always seen as something of the Mandate era, but really it starts in the late Ottoman era. So it was a very important question. Thank you.
Yes, so that's a period of early Zionism that few Zionists are actually aware of. Often they think the first displacement happened in 1948 as a result of the war, but there was displacement that started decades earlier with Jewish landowners buying the land from Jews and early Zionists buying the land from Ottoman landowners, and in many instances displacing those who lived there for many generations.
And often facilitated by anti-Zionist Jews, Ottoman Jews, facilitated by the Ottoman Jews that are actually anti-Zionist, that don't see that the Jews are, in 1908, when you declare equality, the Young Turk Revolution, this idea that you cannot sell land to Jews does not hold does not hold up to the law of equality, right? And they're fighting this in the Ottoman courts. They're Ottoman citizens. They should be able to, and if they want to sell it to non-Jews, they can sell it to non-Jews, right? So this really gets at the heart of the question that we could go on and on.
Right.
Yeah.
What I tried to research this, and I was surprised at how little literature there is on the topic, to the point where I couldn't even get an estimate for how many Palestinians were displaced.
Very hard. Very hard.
Do you have an estimate? Is there any way to?
No, I mean, I think in the Rehovot area, you could. Rehovot area was different. I think the Jews buy the land, and then they own the path that leads to some people. It stops the mobility of two different villages reaching each other, right? So that's not displacement per se, right? They're buying empty land, but the minute you buy it, you block the road, you're going to have conflict, right? So there's no doubt, and Neville Mandel's book, which I see my book is extending. My book is sort of, influenced very much by my professor Rashid Khalidi at Columbia Palestinian Identity, and he wrote the 100 Years of Settler Colonialism, Palestine recently, a brilliant book. Another one, it would be Neville Mandel's book, which I can shoot it to you. You can put it up on the thing. It really goes into detail about the extent of Zionist purchases, different things. It was written in the 70s. It was a brilliant book, written in the 70s, and so much of my book I can bring. I see it right here. In fact, 1 second, I'll bring it.
Sure, yeah. I feel like we need a few hours with Louis here to really get to the bottom of everything.
Yeah, let me pull the light back. This is the thing that's always very happy with your interview qualities also.
Thank you.
This is Arabs and Jews before World War I. Brilliant book. The Arabs and Zionism before World War I, Neville Mandel. Brilliant book that really goes into, so much of my book. This sat next to me. These small details. I do it with a larger brush, strokes. This goes into very, very details. And a lot of what I found supports what he found. And the other one, of course, is Rashid's book, Palestinian Identity, that later on he's done numerous books. These, but this one's written in the 1970s, which is important because I don't know, he doesn't talk about Palestinianism so much, but he does talk about resistance. He does talk about this, and I think he wrote this in the 1970s, and it didn't really make waves. This is the Arab PLO that's like this, so it's a really important book, and I think that might help you to get down some of how many people were removed and were not removed. But okay. In a Fula, it can't be more than a couple hundred. The important point is that these light up conflict. And that's when the people in the urban area start saying, wait a minute, we have a problem on our hands, right? If we want to, it's going to be a domino effect. It's going to affect us also. And that's where they make that bridge with the peasant.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So one more thing. So first of all, Ari, you're asking what it's meant to be a dhimmi. So once this is over, I would just go back to the beginning of the stream because we cover that pretty extensively. You mentioned something that I'm still trying to fully figure out. You said that Herzl at a certain point did not want Jews immigrating to the land. Was this because a lot of the it seems like there was another this is another tension I kind of want to explore. There was conditions for Jews in Ottoman Palestine being considerably better than Europe, which is one thing that could have triggered immigration from Europe, not exclusively the Zionist movement. So was the tension that Herzl didn't want Jews moving and becoming Ottoman and becoming loyal to the Ottoman Empire? Was that where the tension came?
No. He met Sultan Abdulhamid at least one time, I believe 2 times. The idea is that Sultan Abdulhamid says, "This is not my land to sell to you. This is the blood of Ottomans that have such and such and such." That statement that's used over and over and over again was only reported by Herzl through a secondary person. He didn't hear Sultan Abdulhamid II say that, but there was this idea that he was in negotiations to sort of, he said he was going to pay off the Ottoman debts if they gave Jews Palestine. But there was going to be an Ottoman Jewish company that was going to facilitate. So even Herzl, when he's in negotiations with the Ottomans, he doesn't talk about an independent state. Okay, he talks about buying Palestine doesn't work. And he says that we can do the Ottoman Jewish things. But the idea is that Jews going there illegally are going to hinder attempts at reaching agreement with Ottomans, right? So remember, there's only one other person that's very much like Theodor Herzl, and that's Vladimir Jabotinsky. And Vladimir Jabotinsky understands history in a way that I think very few people did. And he sees the Ottomans. He's the head of the Zionist newspaper network in Istanbul in 1908. And Jabotinsky makes one visit to Palestine, like Herzl, and they're not so motivated by it, by the way. Meaning that is more of a hindrance, or that's something secondary. You need to get an international power to promise you a land, right? And Herzl was sincerely worried about the plight of all the Russian Jews starving, right? The Jewish question was, Jews are starving. America's not going to take all of them. Over 1 million have come to the United States. 25,000 went to Palestine, or 30,000 went to Palestine, right? The numbers are, the discrepancy of where Jews think is going to be the future. Now you flip that around in history, you say, wow, now there's more Jews in Israel than there are in the United States. Now that is an interesting thing you could play around with, right? It's a historical phenomenon that would be very hard to explain. Yeah, so Herzl was believed that yes, I think he's impressed. He's impressed with the Hebrew. He's very impressed. But he goes there to meet the first time to meet Kaiser Wilhelm, and he can't meet him in Europe. So when the Kaiser comes to, I think 1901, I have to check my dates again. Kaiser Wilhelm goes to Palestine. Herzl goes there to meet him. Yeah.
So, okay, but I just want to make sure I have the history correct. Were some Jews immigrating to Ottoman Palestine because, not connected to the Zionist movement because they
That's what
thought?
I'm saying, that before 1914, the majority of Jews moving to Palestine were moving because it's the land of Israel. They want to create a new life. They do not define themselves. Zionism as a term only starts in 1897, right? And they do not see themselves really as part of that movement. By 1914, 1905, they converge into one movement. It's after. Remember, think about the Jews of Palestine. Herzl says, okay, great, we'll accept the Uganda offer. Think about that. So the Jews of Palestine, what are, they'd say, what are we, chopped liver? You know what I mean? What do you,
Right.
So, but Herzl was willing to. Now, they lost the vote, but you had a very, very interesting guy named Israel Zangwill, the British playwright that wrote The Melting Pot, that brought Jews to Galveston, Texas, not to create a second ghetto in New York. He, for example, leaves the Zionist movement and he tries to get a Jewish state in Iraq during 1909, and there's negotiations with the Ottomans over this. So that the idea that Herzlian Zionism was this is the weight that's put on the history later on. Jews going there they see themselves as proud to be in their homeland, definitely proud to be speaking Hebrew, reviving Hebrew, stuff like this. But it stops there. The majority are urban Jews, very conservative, and very divided. that start uniting over through Hebrew.
Well, so interestingly, my great-grandfather 10 generations ago moved to Ottoman Palestine from Vilna, Lithuania in 1812. He moved to Tzfat and then to Hebron in 1814. So this was, I guess, the beginning of that
Yeah,
initial.
absolutely.
Yeah,
The idea that you usually go to Palestine, you live in the Chanukah, which is a distribution of money collected. Each community had their own, Jews there praying for them. And then by the 1850s, 1860s, they're starting to say, wait a minute, there's a modern world out there. Maybe we should teaching our children modern topics, modern craftsmanship. The very first school that opened up in 1903 was Betzalel, which is the art school, but it was for crafts, arts and crafts, to get them to become independent people, independent Jews, right? Farming, the first farming settlement, 1877, Petah Tikva, but also Mikveh Yisrael right there, of the farming school. Teach them to be farmers, teach them to be self-sustaining.
right.
So what's happening, Jews around the world, is happening in Palestine also. That's probably the headline here, right? When the modernization Jews are going through that we now translate as Zionist was happening throughout the world. Jewish farmers in New Jersey, Jewish farmers in Argentina, Jewish farmers in Cyprus, right? So.
Awesome. You have time for another question?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. So this is a question from a Hebronite Palestinian. He's asking, are any thoughts about how the land disputes could have caused the violence in Hebron? I think he's referring to the 1929 massacre.
Yeah, I think the 1929 massacre. Hillel Cohen wrote the book on it. Is a watershed moment, and I don't think it's so much the land sales, but the overall state of desperation among Palestinians that erupts into something you would never imagine. In 1899, around then, you have a rabbi who I'm writing about right now. Mani, Rabbi, his last name is Mani, M-A-N-I. He comes in the late 1880s to Hebron. He's from Iraq originally, from Baghdad. And when he dies, his grave is carried by Muslims and Jews throughout Hebron, right? And he was seen as a sage among Muslim communities also. So to understand how 30 years later you have this huge breakout in violence, you only can attribute it to this offsetting of the balance, right? That we talked about in the Ottoman period, that with the British is notched up times 10, right? Notched up times 1,000 even, you could argue, right? Remember, revolts are happening in Syria, 1925 to 1927, Iraq, 1920, Palestine, 1936 to 39, but you have many other breakouts of violence. And I guess our friend that asked the question, what we could understand most likely in a better way, is that the Ottoman era closed the moment where Palestinians, it's the last moment that Palestinians have representation as equals in a system that are in the land, right? It's the last moment. They're the parliamentarians, Ruhi al-Khalidi, Said al-Hosseini. These are the parliamentarians. And this changes after the British period, right? So it's a terrible moment for the Jewish community in Hebron, right? It's a terrible moment in the sort of the trajectory of the conflict, and it's probably the only thing that you can compare it to. I would say I would only compare it to. I don't compare usually things, but I'm saying, October 7th, it's something that you could not foresee. You could not foresee this happening before, right? And the dynamics are quite different. I won't bring that further right now because I would have to go into a long, but I really think that it's a moment in history that changes everything. 1929 changes everything.
Mhm.
And it changes the Jews a lot, it changes the Arabs a lot, and from there on, it's going to be a different story that we're dealing with.
Thank you so much. We're going on an hour and a half, so we'll wrap it up. Any final thoughts you want to share with us? Anything worth noting?
Let me just real fast, because I know I'm just looking at the quick question.
Oh yeah, sure. Feel free to take any other questions.
I think you got the ones I was looking at.
Yeah, there's a lot, but it would take.
There's a question that Danny asked: how much of the blame of the conflict would you put on Zionism? History, I would say, usually doesn't work like that. We don't write, I don't say we don't. As historians, I don't think we put blame on one side or the other side. I would say that we try to understand the dynamics more, right? The dynamics of what is happening. If you follow me, Adar, on that, right? As historians, I say historians are lawyers, we aren't judges. So we try to make a case about something. So it would be hard to. Let me see. I love that you have so much. You have so much interactive things going here. So yeah, it's really impressive. You've been working hard. I see this. You've been working hard. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that then. So thanks for having me. It's really been a pleasure. It's been actual sort of fun. Even I would say.
Yeah. I'm a whole lot smarter than I was an hour and a half ago, and I'd love to do a round 2 at some point to just go deeper on different topics. So thank you so much. For those who want to connect or follow Louis' work, I put links there in the description. You can see his Twitter as well as his website where you could find his book. And I think I'm going to grab your book as well. I'm inspired to do a deep dive now. So thank you so much.
Please
thank
do.
you so much.
Okay,
and
great.
Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week for another stream.